You've called it a bit of a slopdemic instead, where signal is up, but the noise is up with it. Walk me through what actually has changed in terms of submissions hitting bug bounty and disclosure program over the last year or so.
I love how you distinguish vulnerability discovery from vulnerability exploitation, because they're not the same thing. And I do think we're heading towards industrialized exploitation, which is kind of what I think of as the vulnpocalypse. It's like dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria, that kind of scenario, right?
You said there was already a correction underway for AI pricing pressure around pen testing.
If you've got folks that actually do understand, risk management, they've got this like actual mandate or this actual drive inside the organization to reduce risk, they're the ones who are going to pay good money for stuff.
What does sustainable vulnerability handling look like for an open source project with no triage team behind it?
If you've got a bug bounty program, so it's like a VDP with rewards, you're going to 10x the amount of attention that you're getting. And that was true before AI.
Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Casey Ellis. Casey, thanks for being here again.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you back on. We've been kind of texting and missing each other, and time zones will do that when you're on the other side of the world. But now we're in the same continent at least, so that helps.
We're more or less on track, so it's a good thing.
Yeah, we're getting there. But for folks that don't know you, of course, haven't followed your career and what you're up to, please give us a bit of a background real quick.
Yeah, sure thing. Hello everyone, and thank you for having me again, Chris. It's always fun to catch up. My name's Casey Ellis. I'm best known for starting the company Bugcrowd. So, Bugcrowd didn't kind of invent vuln disclosure or bug bounty, but we did kind of kick off this idea of putting a platform in between all of the white hat hackers that are out there and all the people that need their input. That was cool. That definitely escalated quickly. But just in general, been very involved. I've been in cybersecurity like my entire career, really out of high school. More recently, been doing a lot of work on policy and working with cybersecurity startups. So that's the short version. Yeah,
you've done quite a few different things in your career, and you have a pretty broad perspective. And like I said, many folks, and you touched on this, know you from the bug bounty background, the bug bounty platform category, and so on. You kind of help essentially create it from nothing. But these days you're advising, you're investing through Tall Poppy Group, working at the intersection of security, AI, policy. What pulled you from running the company day to day to kind of this broader portfolio of work and that has your attention and interest now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was a couple of things. One was that we'd made some changes over the years. So did the Bugcrowd thing for 13 years, did the CEO thing there for 7. We made a switch, and then we made a second switch. And the second one was awesome. There was kind of a sense of, okay, I'm now in a position where I can sort of step back from this. We were talking about it a little bit just before the show. I actually had some pretty significant health stuff pop up, kind of, out of the woodwork about 2 years ago. So that kind of prompted that thinking along a little bit. But more broadly, honestly, there's a lot to do. I don't see, Bugcrowd is a company, but I started it really as a mission in a lot of ways to kind of democratize the idea of security feedback as much as possible, to try to kind of create a good, safe environment for hackers that operate in good faith to do their thing. And there's a lot of work still to be done on that stuff. You throw AI in on top of that, got involved in all of that back in 22 or so, and it just accelerates it. So there was a part of me that's like, okay, I need to, free myself up to do more and just really figure out what that looks like. That's mostly why.
That's awesome. So I'll definitely get into the bug bounty, the vulnpocalypse, as they call it, the slopdemic, as you call it, all the things like the technical topics. But, I know you actually spent a good amount of time thinking and talking about the policy side of things too.
Yeah.
And I wanted to actually ask, why? I know why. Personally, I think when you look at the field, we see so many, after you've been doing this for some time, you see so many kind of systemic problems that policy is the kind of the blunt instrument that kind of systemically can address some of these things at a broad, expansive level. But I'm curious, what draws you to the policy side? Because I feel like we need more practitioners and technical folks and so on involved on policy.
Amen to that. Yeah, no, 100%. And probably that's actually a big thing. So I'm super involved in Hackers on the Hill, for example, which connects policymakers with technologists. Disclosure, really the kind of the core driver behind the mission of that is to, create the infrastructure that powers vulnerability disclosure across the internet. But part of that is to make it safe and legal and kind of normalized in a lot of ways. And I kind of cottoned onto that being important fairly early into doing Bugcrowd. I think think what you just said is exactly right. Like policy becomes a really important way to drive change. But I think the other thing is that it becomes a really important tool to kind of lock change in once it happens at the precedent and at the grassroots level. So like when I started to see the whole bug bounty thing, and even just like crowdsourced security, like hackers on the outside, not all being burglars, right? We're locksmiths too. Like we knew that in the space, but everyone else didn't. And the law didn't reflect that. So it's like, we need to lock this stuff in because that is a big part of the future. And yeah, that's kind of what got me involved. So it's interesting. I mean, you get to do a lot of really fun stuff. You end up talking to people you didn't ever really expect to speak to. And I think on the legal side, like, the law is just kind of like code. So, when you think about like hacking code or getting code to do a thing that you want it to do that it doesn't currently do, like how to change the state, all those different things, it's an intellectually interesting problem as well.
Yeah, I love that framing, actually, like how you put it, like it's similar to code or systems thinking, because, as you said, we have a lot of technical debt, including in our policies and regulatory environments and how we handle certain things. And that's an awesome framing. I never heard it like that.
I think policy is ultimately a reflection of technical debt. I mean, I'll stop after this, but one part of it is that policy is almost always a trailing indicator of where technology is up to. And I think that's only getting worse. So this idea of like more of us getting involved in this stuff and actually helping, inform where we can, like running for office, if that's a thing that's on your bingo card, like more of us should probably be thinking about that type of thing as well.
Yeah, I agree completely. I've spent a lot of time in the public sector in my career, and it's like it lags technology severely, and like I feel like AI is only exacerbating that. So we need to kind of address it quickly because it's going to get worse. Yeah. So I used these phrases a moment ago, the vulnpocalypse that's kind of taken hold, as people call it, with AI industrializing vulnerability discovery and exploitation and things like that. You've called it a bit of a slopdemic instead, where signal is up, but the noise is up with it. Walk me through what actually has changed in terms of submissions hitting bug bounty and disclosure programs over the last year or so. Yeah,
and honestly, I think just the internet in general, when you think about actual breaches and what those look like too. I think to me, like when I first heard the term vulnpocalypse, I love how you distinguish vulnerability discovery from vulnerability exploitation, because they're not the same thing. And I do think we're heading towards industrialized exploitation, which is kind of what I think of as the vulnpocalypse. That's like dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria, that kind of scenario, right? In a discovery sense, like based off what I've seen over, now 13, 14 years of hacking the internet at scale, like the vulnpocalypse was already here. It just sort of wasn't evenly distributed, right? Like we saw it when we first started throwing a crowd at solving this problem compared to having one person as a pen tester. It's like, oh, okay, there's a lot there that's not being found just because the firepower isn't being applied and because writing secure code is hard. So that's like a pre-existing state. But to your question about the slopdemic, I think the thing that AI has definitely done is, made the cost of discovery of security vulnerabilities a lot lower, and also made the cost of reporting security vulnerabilities a lot lower. So like what happens is this is where you get your slop from, right? It's like I can just send a report because I think this is maybe real, or I'm being opportunistic, or whatever it might be. That's always been a thing, but now it's like 10x. And then on this side, like there's a lot to be found. That's gotten easier as well. So that's gone up 10x at the same time. And you end up with this like delta between, the signal and the noise that's actually a lot bigger than it was before. So that to me is the slopdemic in that sense. It's like, okay, we've got to figure out better ways to understand like risk and triage and all those different things, because ultimately it's not the fault of AI or security research. It's the fault of like software being hard. We're just kind of more, the knowledge of that being true is more evenly distributed at this point. I think is probably the best way to frame it.
Yeah, I like that framing a lot, because like I had written a book on vulnerability management a few years ago, and like it seems like vulnerability management all of a sudden is cool again. Like no one cared about it. It was like this tedious, cumbersome activity that everyone dreaded, and like lived in spreadsheets and scanning tools, and it still does in a lot of ways. But like now everyone's concerned about technical debt and findings and disclosures and remediation, and as you said, like there's also some nuance to it. Like I'd read first, the program that runs like CVEs, et cetera. Like they had put out there that, yes, we're on track to 66 to 100,000 CVEs this year, but exploitation still has remained relatively flat. So there is some nuance there. Doesn't mean it's not going to change in a year or so where maybe we have widespread, industrialization of exploitation, which would be a whole different kind of ball game. But as you're pointing out, like it's been here for a while. This problem has been something that we've been dealing with for some time.
Yeah, you're right. And I think on the exploitation side of things, it's like it's reduction of the cost of being able to chain vulnerabilities together or to create a campaign that has some sort of impact associated with it. The use of AI to drop that cost has kind of trailed the discovery work that's happened, but not by much, frankly. But the other bit there that's, to me, kind of a wild card that we're not really ready for is that it does lower the bar to ride. So you end up with a way more diverse and way broader pool of potential threat actors. I do think that, as a defender industry and as a just general defender conversation, which by the way makes its way into policy as well, we've kind of relied on this fairly predictable set of motivations from the TAs that we expect, and that's in the process, I think, of shifting.
Yeah, I like you use that phrase, lowering the bar, and I feel like you'll hear people say like AI has democratized development. Everyone can be a developer now, citizen developer, these kind of phrases. Well, it's also democratized a lot of other things like vulnerability discovery or maybe exploitation activity and so on. Like it's kind of democratized a lot of things. Some of them good, some of them bad. I think that's what we're dealing with.
And when you think about it, a criminal is just a business person that is on the other side of the law. So like all of the benefits, when you think about like, oh, I can vibe code my idea now and try it on. There's nothing stopping necessarily someone with criminal intent from doing that. It all kind of plays out in the same way. So what it brings it back to is this idea of, from a vulnerability management standpoint, no, we're not going to get around to all of these things. And that was never actually true. And yes, the thing that becomes really important right now is understanding risk and understanding how we prioritize, the things that are most likely to happen to us and the things that we can do to make ourselves as resilient as is rational. It's like possible is not even necessarily the right way to think about that.
Yeah, and there's like, the prioritization conversation is one that enterprises have around, CVSS, EPSS, CAV, exploitability, all these kind of things. But I know you spend a lot of time with the open source community as well. And, I've kind of watched this evolution of this individual, like one of the most kind of present and engaged maintainers in the community, Daniel Stenberg, has kind of, I've watched his arc over the last like 6 months, and it's been fascinating because he went from like, this is all AI slop, get this shit out of here, to like, some of these things are pretty legitimate. And now we're actually finding a lot of things. And like, he's went on this arc that he's went on, and he talked about drowning in slop. Now he's drowning in legitimate findings. And you've written about like volunteer run projects can't sustain bounty infrastructure on their own. What does sustainable vulnerability handling look like for an open source project with no triage team behind it? Because I forget the stat, but I think it's like 1 out of 10 projects has a single maintainer, and 94% have less than 10 or something. I forget but we've always heard that phrase, under enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, and there wasn't enough eyeballs, and there's still not from the maintainer side, but there's definitely a lot more eyeballs from the discovery side of things now.
Look, firstly, fully agree. Like, I think the thing that's been most valuable about like Daniel kind of sharing so much of what's happened with curl is to kind of draw attention to the fact that like this is really hard, and it was already really hard. And I think like full props to curl for actually running a vulnerability intake program that did have a reward attached to it for so long. But the thing there is that like if you've got a bug bounty program, so it's like a VDP with rewards, you're going to 10x the amount of attention that you're getting, and that was true before AI. So like all of a sudden you've like gone and jacked the entire thing up. If you're not ready as an organization to handle that jump in load, you've got to really think about whether or not that's the right way to actually do it. Now, what I do think as well is that like the vulnerability disclosure side of it, so just being ready to receive reports, I think everyone's got to do that. And the reality is that everyone has a VDP, whether they like it or not, they're just maybe not getting the report. So that to me is kind of a primitive. It just becomes a question of like, do you incentivize this stuff or not? And that's, my take on some of the stuff that Daniel's been talking about. But yeah, like the fact that he's drawn so much attention to the fact that like this is a systemically difficult issue to solve for everyone, but especially for open source maintainers that are kind of below the security poverty line when it comes to their ability to respond. I think that's a really important thing to call out. It's going to be an interesting one to fix because I think, we've definitely seen Like I've seen a lot of companies and projects just kind of turn everything off and be like, nah, too much. I can understand that reaction. Like I empathize with that reaction. I'm not saying it's bad or wrong in that sense because, it's a hard thing, like I just said. But at the same time, like that's kind of ostrich risk management at that point in time. And it ultimately doesn't work from a system level security and resilience standpoint. And it'll ultimately kind of end up harming things.
Yeah. Yeah. The security technical debt doesn't go away just because we kind of pretend we don't see it and put blinders on. I had caught
we've tried that before and it didn't work. So I don't think it's going to work this time.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. And so I caught a conversation of you had on a podcast that I was on as well recently called the Secure Disclosure. And I may be misquoting you, but you had used a line and you said like VDP is like putting up a lightning rod while bug bounty is shooting rockets with wire on them into a thundercloud. It's something along those lines. But a lot of organizations still conflate VDP and bug bounty. How should a leader decide when they're ready for which one and how so,
Yeah. So, and just to explain that analogy a little bit more, like I think the version that we were just talking about now, is the idea of like, I don't want you to like, I don't have time or it's inconvenient for you to tell me that I've got vulnerabilities in my stuff, like go away. And like in that metaphor, I kind of relate that to walking outside when there's a storm approaching your house and saying, don't hit me with lightning. Cool. Like it's going to do that whether it wants to or not. And really it's more to me an issue of physics and preparedness as opposed to whether or not you feel like it's convenient on that side of things. Right. So the idea with the lightning rod is that you anticipate that could happen. You set something up for it to be able to go towards and then route it around damage and deal with it. For a bounty, you're going one step beyond, like you're taking advantage of all the same physics, but what you're doing is you're actually proactively going out and trying to encourage that. So and I'm like a weather nerd, so that's, just an analogy I love to dig into sometimes. But yeah, like how you're ready, I think it's really a matter of being in a position where you can tiger team your vulnerability intake, your vulnerability triage, your remediation, your downstream, patch deployment, like depending on whether you're a product company or a library, there's going to be all sorts of different things that are going to be different for every org. But to me, the whole idea of like, can you cope as an organization with 10xing all of that overnight? If you're a company or an entity that says yes to that, then yeah, you're probably good to go. But the reality is that most people kind of can't because they're sort of struggling just with the lightning rod version right now. So this idea of like, okay, we're going to prepare ourselves to deal with security reports reactively because that's not something that we even necessarily control. It's just a part of being on the internet and writing software. So we're going to do that and take that on as a part of like core social responsibility of being on the internet. And then we're going to take whatever advantages we can take from that in terms of what we receive. Then if we're ready, we'll, add a reward to it and start shooting the rockets out. And in the meantime, it's a funny one because I do think that the idea of people paying for bugs, like what is a bug worth, all those different things. I actually see that as a completely separate conversation from a vendor being able to receive a security report and deal with it. Do you know what I mean? Because I think ultimately on the hacker side of things, like this is valuable work. People should get paid for it. And I've been a long time believer in that. So it's not about devaluing that. It's about on the vendor side, how are you preparing yourself for what's coming? And then how do you decide whether or not you want to crank the handle on that?
Yeah, I think it's something that organizations should be looking at carefully because once they do start down that path, like as you said, it's kind of like opening the floodgates. You got to be prepared for what comes with it and have the institutional kind of infrastructure, right, to support it. And speaking about paying for things, like you also on that same podcast, you had made a comment there around pen testing. You said there was already a correction underway for AI pricing pressure around pen testing. It's an uncomfortable message, right, for a big chunk of the services industry in particular.
I think so.
Walk me through like that correction. How do you think it's going to play out and who's going to get squeezed and how?
Yeah, I mean, probably the biggest thing, AI is definitely a component to this downwards pressure because at the very least, it's forcing buyers to ask the question, am I getting value for money? Like, is the thing that I'm paying for this, or is the thing that I'm paying for worth what I'm paying? So like that question in and of itself is being triggered everywhere right now, but especially I think in cyber, and especially I think in areas of cyber where, frankly, we haven't really had a good answer to that question previously. yeah, like the idea of like, cool, I've paid, whatever for this pen test. Like, would I have gotten a result in terms of like my benefit as a business that's worth the same value to me for less money or not? Maybe, who knows? It depends on how you consume that stuff, like the quality of what you're getting, whether it's associated with like actual risk mitigation, or if you're just doing it for compliance or something like that. I do have a theory that I throw around a lot that's not super popular, but I think it's true, that we've built a lot of the cybersecurity industry on this idea of selling to people that actually don't really care, right? Like, if you've got folks that actually do understand, risk management, they've got this like actual mandate or this actual drive inside the organization to reduce risk, they're the ones who are going to pay good money for stuff because they understand the value of it and they're going to go out looking for that value. For everyone else, there's this automatic compression of the margin just because of some of these dynamics that are kicking in. So yeah, it's a weird one because I sort of feel uncomfortable talking about it sometimes just on account of all of the AI's, scary from like a job prospect standpoint. That's true too, I think, in a lot of ways. But if you've got this industry that's sort of pretty inflated to begin with in terms of its ability to actually defend the value that it's delivering, then it's automatically going to be more vulnerable to that.
That last piece, I was going to comment on a few things you said there, but that last piece is so true in terms of the struggling to communicate value that security provides, because like we're often trying to prove a negative in this career field sometimes. Like, it's hard to quantify, it's hard to explain. You need it, but you can't explain necessarily, you can't quantify the value a lot of times. There's a lot of different efforts to quantify, risk management and things like that in cybersecurity, but the value to the business in particular is something that we have struggled with for a long, long time.
And it's honestly something that I like. I'm coming back to the bug bounty model, and I'm not talking about the bug bounty model as expressed by Bugcrowd or HackerOne or any of the like platforms, like whatever. This core kind of pre-existing model of, okay, that's a vulnerability that I'm willing to pay for because I'm now going to go off and mitigate it, and like the value to me around that mitigation is going to be proportionate to what I pay. That's how the bad guys do it, and they don't even have to be bad guys. You think about the offensive vulnerability research industry, right? Which predates all of this. The reason they can answer that question, I think, a lot more effectively is they're building a product from it. So for them, it's a positive return, not the mitigation of a negative one. And what I wanted to see, and I have, I think, to some degree seen happen with bug bounties, is causing people to think about vulnerabilities and risk in a way that's more directly tied with economics. But yeah, outside of that, we kind of suck at it just in general. Because it is effectively like cyber defense just in general as an industry. Like if we do it right, nothing happens. So cool. Like would nothing have happened anyway? We're not quite sure. And that's a overly primitive way of kind of putting it, but if you think about the economics that drive the entire market, I think it's a pretty good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the nature of how it works, and like we all know this, that like after an incident, budgets tend to go up because now there's something to kind of point to, right? I want to ask you about this too. I spent a lot of time on resilient cyber, of course, and through blogs and interviews and so on, talking about the strain on CVEs and MVD and vulnerability databases, et cetera. You've written about the window between vulnerability existing and someone noticing it is compressing like to basically instant. If a discovery goes to near instant while remediation stays at kind of the human speed that we are used to with the vulnerability backlogs, what do you kind of see breaking first in the vulnerability management pipeline? Because it doesn't look promising if that's the case, if that's the way it's headed.
Yeah. I think we're going to need to rethink a lot of things, honestly. Like, and that's something. I've talked a lot about the idea of like the OODA loop. So orient, observe, decide, act. Like that's been, from my perspective, fairly predictable in our industry for the last 15 years or so. And now between like AI discovery, but then also lowering the bar to ride, so you got more people motivated to do attack stuff for more reasons. You throw on top of that the fact that the world's just generally getting spicier and kind of not really slowing down when it comes to that. This like OODA loop, I think, is small to the point that we can't necessarily count on being able to fit inside it going forward. I kind of feel like we're already there, but I don't feel like that's as necessarily well agreed on. So when it comes to vuln management, like how do you think about break glass mitigation when you need to do that? How do you think about your risk management, risk assessment, like ongoing threat modeling, so that you can be like really as an organization thinking as proactively as possible around how to stay ahead of this stuff? And then honestly, like planning to fail. Like, how do you do detection, containment, ejection, recovery, like all those different parts of the process as effectively as possible? If we've just been focused on prevention, then that's gonna be rough, because at some point when that fails, you've got a blast radius that's kind of uncontained, and you're gonna have to do that reactively, which is not how you should necessarily be doing that. So this is not me saying vulnerability management is dead or any of that kind of thing. I do think that we're going to need to start to think a lot more creatively about how we're approaching the overall issue of defense. And, that includes, like, how do we think about imposing cost on attackers? Like, if we've got, this whole WordPress thing that just happened, something that I've been thinking about a lot lately with like really broadly deployed systems that kind of create a system level issue. Like, what if we need to patch other people's stuff because all of a sudden there's like a mass event going on? Like, I think I said it on the other podcast as well, but like, the idea of like hackback, the idea of non-cooperative defense, I personally don't. Those ideas make me uncomfortable because it's messy. But given the current trajectory that we're on, I don't see us not arriving at a place where we need to be doing stuff like that. So like, what do we do in the meantime, right?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you another question, but that's such a fascinating thing, because I feel like in the last, not to get political, but in the last administration, I did hear some of this stuff about, particularly like, I think you called it non-cooperative defense, where, you go in and impact someone else's system, but there was a lot of debate about...
It's a beautiful euphemism. I love it.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about, well, what if you take down a commercial system, the government like impacts, business operations, et cetera. And then like the hackback has been kind of something that's gotten more steam recently in this administration around going on the offense and imposing costs on attackers. But then these are perfect examples of like technical topics that have broad policy and geopolitical implications and business economic implications, all these kind of things. So it's the intersection of technology and society. So they're really fascinating. You made a comment about thinking creatively and doing things differently. I wanted to bring back to, before we wrap up, VDP and bug bounty. You also have written and spoke about kind of giving a concrete playbook that included, kind of automating most of the slop triage, raising payouts for hard findings instead of cutting rates across the board. For security leaders like listening right now, like who run a VDP or a bug bounty, what are some of the things they should look to change maybe in the next quarter or two?
Yeah, look, I think, like we kind of talked about earlier on, like if your inability to deal with incoming vuln reports is causing you to just do these ones, then, to me, you're not alone, so don't feel terrible about that. I think that's happening right across the board. And it's not just with vulnerability management. This is like SIMSOR, like all of the different things that are kind of externally triggered are just getting absolutely hosed right now. So there is, I think, in our cyber defense category, this just global need to get better at triage and get better at kind of understanding, what's important, like what can we like definitively rule out as noise, and how can we do that as quickly as we possibly can, but also like not screw it up. And that's the hard part. The early days of spam filters, like that's an example of what that looks like when it goes wrong, right? So there's definitely a lot of people working on that problem. Like part of what I've been trying to work on with some of the others around the Disclose.io stuff is how do we start to find ways to implement that at a system level on this whole kind of vulnerability reporting across the internet problem. But again, that's going to look different for everyone because it's just kind of a global generic issue at this point in time. So sorry, if you invert that, it's like, all right, well, and this goes back to the guide thing that I wrote. How do you put more emphasis on the signal that you do want? Because it's like you can't tell the internet to be quiet. That's not going to work. So, all right, if you've got a signal to noise issue, the other way to solve that is to increase your signal in proportion to the noise. And what that's going to take as a leader is to figure out what's important to your business, like what are the things that are the greatest risk factors that you can kind of encourage good faith security researchers to go off and demonstrate. How do you reward them for that so they keep coming back to do more of it? And you kind of build that whole thing out and actually build out a relationship with this sort of elastic, team that exists out there on the internet available to help. It's both at the same time. And I think where we get stuck is that a lot of people think of it as one or the other. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, as I was listening to you say that, I thought of the phrase like incentives drive behavior, right? And so I think if you want to change the behavior of that elastic team, as you called it, you have to incentivize certain things, and then that will change the way they behave and the way they interact with you and what they maybe bring to your attention and so on. Like that incentive is going to change. It will help drive those behaviors. So that's a great point. And I was going to ask last question for you here. You mentioned Disclose.io. We've talked about that a couple times throughout the conversation. I know you're on the board for the Security Research Legal Defense Fund. And of course, you co-founded Disclose.io. You've called CFAA a reform priority. First off, for folks not familiar, what is that? And then over the next couple of years, as AI-generated research pressure keeps building, which of these policy levers matter most for kind of keeping good faith research safe?
I saw, and for the audience, I got a pre-run on this question. I was dreading it actually coming up because choosing between the three things is tricky. But look, I think the CFAA, so the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, it's basically an anti-hacking law, federal law in the US that's makes hacking illegal. There's been charging rule changes that we managed to get through the DOJ back in 2022 that mean that you have to actually prove intent, that it was for a bad reason, which is good because prior to that, it's basically if you break a computer, you're automatically a criminal and you have to prove that you aren't.
Can I ask something real quick there? So you said you have to prove intent, or you no longer have to prove intent?
So you have to prove intent to bring a criminal prosecution.
So let me ask, okay, so criminal versus civil suit is actually a difference there.
We can double click into this and it's a whole new podcast.
I want to ask about this because, there obviously the news this week is like a Frontier Lab, kind of had an incident where it impacted another organization and it wasn't intentional. And I think as agentic AI kind of becomes more mainstream where systems are taking action on their own, right, and being very creative and doing things that we didn't intend for them to do, I could see that getting real messy. Like, we didn't mean to do it per se, but
yeah. So the reality of that one is that like intent is really hard. Like it's the reason that the charging rule changes are good as progress but imperfect is that intent is really difficult to discern at wire speed, and that's always been true. So like when this charging rule stuff came through in 22, it's like great, this is progress. Still not a perfect solution. And by the way, all of the states have their own laws too in the US, and then you got like international laws and all sorts of other stuff. So that's the challenge with it. I do think that, between like Frontier Labs having sandbox escape issues and even frankly, good faith security researchers having their hackbots go off the rail, which is a thing sometimes. There are all of these different examples of computers doing things to other computers that look like exceeding authorized access that may have been in good faith but look like they weren't. And then like the decision tree around like, okay, was that a good thing or a bad thing? Do we try to bring, a civil or a criminal suit? That gets real messy. So like at some point those laws are going to need to be rewritten to kind of acknowledge how the internet works, I think, in a lot of ways. In the meantime, for researchers, it's like documenting your work and making sure that if there's ever a misunderstanding, you can actually talk people through that. And I think going back to what you asked around, Disclose.io and SRLDF, like SRLDF exists for when basically companies are just literally trying to, bring a lawsuit because they're annoyed, right? So this was clearly good faith research, but the recipient's like, I don't like that. That's pissing me off. Here's a suit. Like I'm trying to suppress and censor that research and ultimately like intimidate you out of doing more of it. So that exists to basically defend that. And it's a bunch of people that have been doing this stuff for a really long time. So like part of what we've signed up for is try to discern this wire speed intent problem that you just called out, which is fun sometimes, but someone's got to do it. I think the other side of it with Disclose.io, like the goal there, aside from putting out like infrastructure to make this as simple and straightforward as possible, is to kind of normalize it. So it's like, okay, here are the rules of the road, more or less. Here's what you do as an organization to say, hey, we're willing to receive security reports from the outside world and we won't prosecute that. But by the way, if you're a bad guy, we're still going to cloud up and rain. And it doesn't mean that people on the internet can do whatever they like. That's a tricky balancing act to write. So there's a lot of tooling in there to try to make that easier is really what it comes down to. So yeah, there's a lot. I mean, that's a like an internet scale.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think we're going to solve this in a 60-minute conversation, but just there's a great pausing point because as you point out, like there's so much to this. There's technical, there's societal, there's economics, there's legal, and I appreciate you jumping on and diving into it with me. And I always enjoy kind of following your insights and your perspective. So thanks so much for jumping on again, man.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me and hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Likewise. Cheers.
Cheers.